Hi there, everyone. Welcome to the first video for, I believe, week 7. This is going to be our first week on Leibniz. And so this video is going to be aimed towards giving an introduction to his thought, as well as sort of laying out the series of distinctions that he proposes in his own meditations, right? So we read Descartes. Descartes wrote his meditations, right? And we read that entire text together, and we've been thinking about it one way or another ever since. We saw that Spinoza sort of wrote his own version of the meditations with the treatise on the emendation of the understanding. And now we're going to see this, a kind of next big canonical figure that has his own huge metaphysical system is Leibniz. And so he's going to be sort of the last rationalist philosopher that we're going to focus on, and he's going to occupy our attention for the next few weeks. And so this video is really aimed at, giving an analysis of the distinctions that he makes in his own meditations, because this lets us know sort of like his mode of thinking, how he's addressing the sort of epistemological distinctions that we've seen emerge in Descartes and Spinoza. And it will just sort of give us, a fresh take on his own perspective for dealing with these kinds of issues. Now, before going into Leibniz's meditations proper, I think it's important that we give some context for who Leibniz is, why we continue to study him, why is he important, what is his position in this history, and so on. Leibniz is a very interesting figure. He's very weird for a lot of reasons. And to speak very, plainly, he's my favorite of this period. I just think that he is kind of endlessly fascinating. He is really fascinating in part because when you read his philosophy, it almost seems like science fiction. Like, really, some of his descriptions of substance and so on are very, very out there. And so Leibniz is a very difficult philosopher, but he's also an extremely fascinating philosopher. Leibniz, the way that he tends to think about and introduce his own work to other people is what he would say is that sort of after Spinoza, what happens in Europe is a crisis about the relationship between reason and faith, right? And we've seen this really characterize early modern philosophy up to this point. We saw, as I've mentioned several times, Descartes' dedicatory letter to the Sorbonne, the preface to the Meditations, where Descartes is very clearly, laying out his own relationship to orthodox religious beliefs. And in Descartes, we sort of have this belief that we can have a nice marriage between faith and reason, right? That faith and reason can harmonize, they can go together, that there's no essential conflict between them, and that philosophers should be allowed to talk about God too, right? That's sort of one of Descartes' implications of his analysis. But Leibniz and other figures like Dale would say is that the Cartesian way of navigating the relationship between faith and reason is incomplete. It's incomplete. Why? Well, because when someone takes those principles to their extreme, then you end up in very heretical beliefs. You end up with, these philosophical doctrines that are sort of meant to tie up to certain kind of religious doctrines, but that don't really do it very well. The case in point for Leibniz is like Descartes' cogito, right? And Descartes claimed that the cogito is, essentially a defense of the soul, right? this is something he said in that letter I mentioned, the dedicatory letter to Sorbonne, is that he proves the eternal reality of the mind, and thereby so doing, he also proves the eternal nature of our souls, right? And the reason why the destruction of our body does not commit us to the idea of the destruction of our personality or the destruction of our soul, right? So that's the cogito argument, and Leibniz's criticism of it is that Descartes does not really do what he intends to do. He does not really sufficiently link up faith and reason. Why? Well, because he hasn't really proven the existence of a soul. But for Leibniz, what's essential to the soul is that souls have one life, right? They have that kind of memory, right? And this is essential to the Christian conception of the afterlife. It's not like, it's supposed to be that like whenever you die and your spirit raises to heaven and you reach the pearly gates or whatever, that you get there and you're like, I am the cogito, I'm a thinking substance and I'm nothing else, right? No, you're supposed to have memory of your previous life, right? But memory is something that Descartes indexes to the brain. It's something he indexes to the body. So even though he says you get a soul, it's like an empty soul. It doesn't have anything to do with my personality. The cogito doesn't say anything about me as Penelope, right? It says something that is true about everyone, which is that they're a thinking substance. So what the essence or the core of Leibniz's argument is here is that Descartes' attempt to negotiate the relationship between reason and faith is unsuccessful. It's unsuccessful because he was not a strict enough rationalist. Leibniz, unlike Spinoza, is a radically Christian philosopher. And what I mean by that is that Leibniz believes that a thoroughgoing rationalistic interpretation of the universe will vindicate rather than undermine the doctrinal beliefs of Christianity, right? And so you have the exact opposite position of Spinoza, right? Spinoza seemed to say, if you follow rationalism clearly, then you leave orthodoxy, right? You leave traditional orthodox beliefs. Now Leibniz is saying to the contrary, no, the problem with Spinoza wasn't that he was too rationalistic or something like that. That's something that like Bale might try to say, right? But instead, the problem is really fundamentally that he was not rational enough. He did not think through the fundamental problems with sufficient levels of clarity. And that is why he arrived at the unorthodox and heretical conclusions that he arrived at. So there is a tendency to think about Leibniz as a kind of backwards figure, right? I think that sort of like what the more contemporary narrative about the relationship between science and religion is that religion is anti-scientific. Right, the further that science goes, the more religion shrinks, and vice versa. Right, so we would tend to think about somebody as like Leibniz, who is extremely devoutly Christian, as sort of like walking back on the scientific advances made by the early modern philosophers. However, that is not true. Leibniz was a better and more important natural scientist and mathematician in many ways than Descartes, and certainly more so than Spinoza. Leibniz invented a calculator that could do multiplication. He was an extremely talented mathematician. He invented differential calculus concurrently with Newton. There's this like whole big controversy over this, and really Leibniz is very well loved and celebrated among natural scientists like Einstein, because of his extreme boldness. You know, he was willing to say things about the natural world that other people were afraid, really, of saying, and also theses, you know, hypotheses about the world that are truly, truly wild. I mean, they really do read like science fiction in a lot of ways. But he is seen as a forerunner, you know, not only for philosophy, not only for mathematics, but he's also seen as like one of the early inventors of formal logic. He's seen as one of the early inventors of linguistics, one of the early pioneers of computer science, of library science. He actually organized libraries. He was a diplomat. He was a historian. You know, really one of these Enlightenment figures that did it all, you know, and did it at a way that he was cutting edge in at every level that he decided to engage in. Just truly one of these people that is a world historical genius. You know what I mean? Like another Enlightenment figure, Diderot, described, you know, he said he wrote he wrote an encyclopedia, right? So this is an enormous Enlightenment project, and he's seen as one of the most important Enlightenment thinkers, right? But he would say stuff, you know, like when you compare your own worth to Leibniz, like you just want to throw all of your papers in the fire, right? And his basic idea is like, well, we just can't really reach the same heights that Leibniz did, no matter how hard we try individually, right? And so there's a ton of respect for Leibniz during the period. In part too, because it's like Leibniz as a figure is somebody who is way more interested in like correspondences with people, like sending letters back and forth, than writing a big long book. Like there's no equivalent of the Ethics or something like that for Leibniz, where it's like this is the big hulking tome that says everything that Leibniz ever had to think, right? Or anything like that. Instead, what he says, his model of a perfect philosophical text is instead something that would prove the most in the least time. Right? And so the completeness of the work, this big long tome or treatise or something like that, that was very off-putting for Leibniz. It very much went against his own conception of like what perfection is, and his idea of perfection is efficiency, right? And so he really thought a lot about formal models, and here you can see the resonance with like computer science in mathematics, right? And really wanted to come and try to understand them and to develop them at a higher level. So that's kind of a brief, you know, description of Leibniz, why Leibniz is considered important, and you know, what we intend to cover over the next few weeks, which are going to be primarily aimed at Leibniz, but we're also going to be reading some other figures like Du Châtelet. Okay. We're starting with this text, the Meditations. Why are we starting with it? Well, first of all, because it goes in nicely with this thing of like all of the early modern rationalists like trying to rewrite the Meditations, the Cartesian Meditations, right? And so I think it's very nice for that reason. It really gives us a sense for how important the Meditations were for all of these philosophers. But in addition to that, this is actually one of the first things that Leibniz really publishes. And so it gives us a really good insight into the mode of his thinking, right? What does it mean to think rationally and clearly and so on, right? So what we're going to try to do is we're going to go through, I drew up like a little chart of the distinctions that Leibniz brings up. in the Meditations. In many ways, they resemble what Descartes said in his Meditations, but they're actually a little bit more precise than what Descartes was saying. And I think that that's a very interesting thing for us to decide to latch onto for this video. So Leibniz describes knowledge, right? The central theme of this investigation is to think about cognition, right? Which is a little bit wider than knowledge. Knowledge you maybe think about as things that we're sure about or something like that. Whereas cognition's a little looser. Cognitions can be false, right? And it kind of refers more to the process of forming beliefs. Like, how do we do that? How can we do it at like, a better, more rational way? Something to that effect. And what Leibniz does in this text is he segments our knowledge into 4 distinct levels, which I've tried to illustrate here through the different colors that I've used. And I've also tried to write down the different levels, right? And what characterizes each level of knowledge is that it asks a certain kind of question, right? And I've also written the central distinctions for each level right here, right? So what's the point? Well, Descartes in his Meditations talked about clear and distinct ideas, right? He claimed that clear and distinct ideas are what allow us to have certain knowledge, it's what makes us rational, and so on. And usually these words went together. Clear and distinct, clear and distinct, clear and distinct, right? And it can be difficult sometimes to know, like, well, what does that mean? What does it mean for something to be clear versus something to be distinct, right? We didn't really talk about that very much. Descartes talks about that a little bit in the Principles of Philosophy, but for the most part, that hasn't been our focus so far in class. But Leibniz is really, really good about distinguishing these things. And this gives us a very rigorous epistemology, a very rigorous conception of how our knowledge works, right? So knowledge, okay, let's work at the first level of knowledge. And at the first level of knowledge, the central distinction is obscurity versus clarity. So is our knowledge obscure or is it clear, right? And essentially, if it remains obscure, it stays at the first level. If it's clear, it has the possibility of moving on to the second level of knowledge, right? And so these categories on the left, obscurity, confusion, inadequacy, and symbolism, these are bad words. These are words to describe when our knowledge is somehow inadequate, somehow incomplete, obscure, confused. All of these are ways of saying that our knowledge here is imperfect, right? Whereas these categories on the right side refer to ways that our knowledge can be more perfect, right? Okay. So the first distinction is obscurity versus clarity. And I'm just going to move over a little bit here. So obscurity versus clarity, right? And the central question of this level, I've written out right here, do I know what it is? Right? So, this describes a kind of experience where our knowledge is so low that it's almost hard to describe, right? Like, if you just hear like a loud bang or something like that, like you don't even know what it is, right? You can't answer the question, what is that, right? you don't, you know, you haven't even really processed it yet, right? Um, and so this is essentially like the lowest level of knowledge. It's like kind of being like in shock, right? You're in the process of like, what the hell was that, right? And so if you're still at that level of knowledge where you can't even really say exactly what it is, or you can't even say exactly what you mean, right? Sometimes like you want to use vocabulary or philosophical terminology, but you don't actually really even know what it's saying fully, right? I've gone through this experience. I'm not just describing y'all making mistakes or something like that. I probably do this more than y'all, where you know it's a philosophical idea and it's very difficult for me to understand what is meant by it, right? And so it remains at the level of obscurity rather than clarity. Whereas something is very clear when I know of it. I know what it is. I can point it out, right? And so a sharp pain, for example. A sharp pain is something that is very, very clear, right? You know that you're in pain. You know it is pain, right? You don't have any confusion like, is this painful or is it pleasant, right? No, you know for sure in the cases of sharp pain, it is clear to you it is pain. Maybe, afterwards it gets mixed with whatever other emotions, but at least it starts out as something clear. It's painful, right? Okay, so this is the first level. Can you even identify, what it is that you claim to know? That's the first level of knowledge. And this is imaginative knowledge, right? So when I ask, do I know what it is? Like, can I form a conception of it? Do I have a representation of it, right? Can I even form like a mental picture of what it is, right? If I can't do that, it's obscure. If I can do that, it's clear. Okay. So now clear level, second level, clear, there's no second level for obscure ideas. You get left off in the first level, right? But you can have a clear idea that is confused. That might sound very confusing. How can you have a clear idea that is confused, right? Well, okay, imagine the situation. I'm out on a walk, right? And I see a bug. So it's clear in the sense that I know it is a bug, right? Maybe I can't, say what species of bug it is, or species of roach, or, like whatever else, right? I'm a little bit confused. It's a little bit unclear, what kind of bug it is, right? It's clear that it is a bug, but it's confused in the sense that I cannot distinguish, right, a beetle from a roach versus, all of these different other subspecies and so on, right? And so actually, for Leibniz, this is probably where we hang out the most, Like this is generally like where we are at whenever we're using our everyday reasoning. We know what it is that we're talking about, but we have a confused notion of it, right? We have a very imprecise idea. And so the concept of bug is perfect for that, right? I can distinguish bugs from animals and so on, but I can't distinguish bugs from each other. And so it's a clear notion to me, but it's also somewhat confused, right? By contrast, geometrical knowledge, right, is distinct. So like think about your ability to imagine a triangle versus knowing geometrically the rules for constructing a triangle, right? If you are working with a mental picture of a triangle, right? So you maybe have something like this, right? Okay, that's like basically an equilateral triangle or whatever, right? So you might be saying, if you have a confused idea of a triangle, if you understand a triangle like how a child understands a triangle, right, then, you just kind of know that it looks like this, right? And so then, do you know everything that is a triangle? Well, if you were to ask like a baby that doesn't know geometry or something like that, they might just think that stuff that this, looks like this thing is a triangle. And so they might be liable to confuse like a diamond shape with a triangle. They might disqualify this upside down triangle, and so on, right? Because they're like, well, it resembles the triangle insofar as it's blue, or it doesn't resemble the triangle insofar as it's, displaced on the plane in this way, right? And so a child who has a confused geometrical notion of a triangle might say, as a result of this confusion, that this diamond that closely represents the triangle is a triangle, right? They might confusedly say that and be wrong. And they might also deny that certain displacements of triangles are really triangles, right? Because they don't know the rule for what makes something a triangle. Whereas, if you have a distinct knowledge of triangles, then you know the rule underlying the construction of triangles. And so it's not just that stuff looks like this, right? But that triangles have to have 3 sides and 3 angles, and they have to be enclosed, and the interior angles equal 180 degrees, and so on, right? And so what it means to ascend from a confused notion to a distinct notion is a rule, right? And I'll write that here. What you need more than anything here is a rule. You need a rule for distinguishing what it means to be a triangle or what it means, to be anything else from what it's not, right? So another example, for Leibniz, biological knowledge is fundamentally confused. Why? Well, because all we can provide are sort of like groupings of what mammals are like, right? Our level of knowledge is like the child's understanding of geometry, where we're just saying, these animals kind of look like each other, they resemble each other, and so, we put them in a formal classification together, right? But we don't have anything that's like a definitive criteria or something like that for what makes something a mammal. We have a bunch of different characteristics that we associate with being a mammal, but we don't have anything like a distinct rule, right? And so the second level is mixed, right? Because you're kind of looking at empirical or imaginative phenomena, but you're applying a rule to them, right? And that rule is what makes it partly rational. And that's why it's a mixed kind of knowledge. And so then the question of the second level is, can I distinguish it, whatever is the object of my knowledge, can I distinguish it from other things with a rule, right? So in the case of the platypus, right, in the case of thinking about what it means to be a mammal, we can't provide a rule, right? And so it's not a distinct kind of knowledge, it cannot ascend to the next level. Okay. So at the first level, knowledge can be obscure and clear. At the second level, they can be confused and distinct. And at the third level, they can be adequate or inadequate. This distinction can be harder for people to understand because, a lot of the times geometry was a long time ago for many of us. But this is really kind of like what Leibniz is thinking. Leibniz is thinking, when you have a distinct notion, whenever you have like a geometrical understanding of a triangle, it's one thing to be mathematically capable, right? That maybe you could describe a number of mathematical thinkers in this way. So like Archimedes. Archimedes was like an incredibly intelligent Greek mathematician. He discovered several important facts about the world and so on. Discovered the world was flat and calculated its curvature and so on. However, from Leibniz's standpoint, even though Archimedes, as a mathematical figure, had distinct knowledge, he had distinct knowledge that was inadequate. Adequate, right? It's not complete. And so the question of the third level is this idea complete or sufficient, right? And here is where Leibniz would draw the distinction between Archimedes and Euclid, right? He would say that what Euclid did is Euclid gave us an adequate conception of geometrical ideas. In other words, the rule that you identified for the construction of triangles, can it construct every triangle? And can it give us all of the properties of triangles, right? Can we explain everything there is to explain about triangles, right, from the rule that we've given? If the answer is no, then you have an inadequate notion. You have a notion that captures some essential parts of what you're talking about, but it doesn't cover everything, right? And so is this idea complete or sufficient? In the case of Archimedes, the answer is, I think from a Leibnizian perspective, no. Whereas in the case of Euclid, right, who in his Elements gives definitions of what triangles and squares and other geometrical figures and so on are, Leibniz would say these are adequate notions. These are notions that completely explain what it is that they're meant to be about. Right? Do you explain everything? If you say no, then you remain at this third form of knowledge. If you say yes, then you can rise to the level of this fourth level of knowledge. And this fourth level of knowledge is really, really interesting, because Leibniz says, okay, so up to this point, we've taken an object of knowledge, we've asked, do we know what it is? Yes. Can we distinguish it from other things? Yes. Do we know completely what it is that we're talking about? Yes. Right? Usually, at this point, you end the analysis, right? In many ways, you could say, like, this is where Spinoza ended, right? He defined what an adequate notion was. Now he feels he's done, right? That's it. Once you have a complete idea, you know what it is, and you know what the rule for distinguishing it is, like, what else could you know, right? And so here's where we get to the fourth level. Is this idea real? Which might be a very strange question to ask. Surely Descartes and Spinoza would be like, what? Like, how could you possibly ask if this idea is real after you've already defined it, after you have given a rule for it, and you've discovered that it's a completely adequate notion? Well, under this category of symbolic, we can write purely formal systems. And this is why Leibniz is in many ways the forefather of several formalistic disciplines. So computer science, formal logic, linguistics, all of that stuff, really Leibniz is a pioneer. Why is he a pioneer? Because he was a genius, and he discovered that you can have entirely formal systems that are completely clear, so you understand exactly what it is that you're talking about. They're completely distinct. You understand the rule for constructing it. And it is perfectly, completely defined. Right? But nonetheless, it is still not about reality. think about programming languages, right? Programming languages are clear, they are distinct. You can write a program that says hello world instead of writing a program that says get out of town or whatever, right? It's clear, it's distinct, it's adequate even because you know everything about what the programming language can do and how it can do it, right? But it's symbolic because it's just a way of like manipulating symbols and moving symbols around, right? We don't yet know from the fact that we've constructed a formal system that the formal system has traction, right? That it like links up to the world, right? And in the case of like programming languages are meant to do stuff, right? They're meant to be functional. They're not knowledge per se, right? They're not saying true things about the world. They're, producing outputs from certain kinds of inputs, right? And so you can have a completely clear, a completely distinct, and a completely adequate idea of something, but that idea can still not link up to the world. It can still not be real. It can be a purely symbolic system. So like in the same way that we could have, binary is a base 2 mathematical system. So what that means is that instead of writing all the way up to 10, you just have zeros and ones, right? So, if I wanted to represent the number 3 in a binary framework, I would do that as 1, 0, right? Because the first place, right? If I wanted to be 3, then it would be 1, right? Plus 2 equals 3. So I would write 3 in binary as 1, 1, right? So instead of going all the way up to 10, it just goes from 0 to 1, right? And Leibniz's point is, you can write these mathematical frameworks however you want. You can do a base 2 system, you can do a base 10 system, you can do a base 12 system. Some people say that base 12 system is actually more efficient than a base 10 system because a base 12 system is divisible by 3 and 4, whereas a base 10 system is only divisible by 2 and 5. Why do we have a base 10 system? Well, we have 10 fingers, right? And so Leibniz's point is that like this feature about how we think about mathematics is purely symbolic, right? It's just a feature about how we can manipulate formal systems, different ways that we can write things down, right? Different ways that we can model stuff, and you can build increasingly sophisticated models. And this is how Leibniz discovered differential calculus. He was like, okay, well, what if you just related relations to each other, right? You related differentials to each other rather than relating variables. That's a little nerdy. This last couple minutes has been pretty nerdy, but let's pull it in now. The whole point is that something being clear, distinct, adequate, consistent, and so on is not enough for it to be real, right? Is this idea real? We have to ask about whether or not it's intuitive, right? Whether or not it has any necessary grip on us. So, to give a sort of wider overview at the 4 levels, right? The first level is imaginative knowledge. So this is when we see things, hear things, we form a mental picture of them. They're always obscure, right? My mental picture of a triangle never corresponds exactly to the essence of a triangle. Because any triangle I imagine in my mind is a particular triangle. It's equilateral, isosceles, right triangle, and so on, right? I had to imagine a particular triangle to give a mental representation of it. But the essence of a triangle is not contained in any of these images. It's not like any one of those triangles is like the real triangle or something like that. They're all triangles, right? And so knowledge that I imagine is always obscure. It doesn't exactly correspond to the rational knowledge, the pure knowledge, because it's always affected by my senses and my limited capabilities. Whereas the next level, what clearly distinguishes the second level is giving a rule, right? And rules can be better or worse, right? So like one rule for mammals is that mammals, for the most part, do not fly, right? That would be a way that would be reliable in very, very many cases for distinguishing mammals from birds, but it would fail in some important cases, right? It would fail in the case of bats, for example, right? Bats are a mammal that fly. And so in that case, you have a rule, you have a clear idea, but it's confused. It's not the right rule. Whereas distinct notions, they're able to separate stuff according to a rule. So like when you really know how to distinguish stuff, as when you know the geometrical essence of a triangle. So then the next level is just about completeness, right? It's like, does your rule deal with every case? Does your rule give us the essence of the thing as a whole? Yes or no? Very many of our notions are inadequate, right? They don't tell us everything there is to know about that thing. It tells us some important aspects about it. Whereas adequate notions, like in the adequate notion of a triangle, you can know everything about all of the triangles they could ever be constructed, right? And then finally, the last level of knowledge is this knowledge real, right? And here we get a distinction between purely formal kinds of knowledge and real kinds of knowledge. And so you can have a perfectly clear, distinct, adequate kind of knowledge that is nonetheless still formal, still not real. And this is going to be a big part of how Leibniz engages with the other rationalist philosophers, is he thinks that they've not sufficiently asked or answered the question, are the notions that I am examining, are they truly adequate? Are they, in fact, intuitive? Are they real, right? And insofar as we stick to the right side of this board and we gain intuitive knowledge, then we most resemble God, right? So this right side really describes like God's way of knowing things. And so the closest that we can possibly approximate to that, the more perfectly we'll be able to know anything. Okay, next video coming up on Leibniz's notion of God and matter. I hope you're all having a good week. Thanks. Bye.